Right. Welcome, everybody. People are just coming in from the waiting area. Thank you for your patience in waiting. We'll give people a minute or two to wander into the webinar. All right, I think we've had numbers look like they're stabilizing. So welcome, everyone. We're so glad you could join us today. I'm really excited about this material today, and I think it's going to be a great discussion. Couple quick reminders. Remember to mute your microphone. Feel free to put questions in the chat. This is being recorded, and it'll be available at the recipes website and at the Food Waste Collaborative website at the once that video becomes available. Today's webinar is a joint effort of the Recipes Network, Resilient, Equitable, and Circular Innovations with Partnership and Energy Synergies. This is a NSF-funded Sustainable Regional Systems Research Network that focuses on creating a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable food system through the lens of reducing wasted food. Also through the cooperation of the Ohio State Food Waste Collaborative that I lead here at Ohio State. My name is Brian Rowe. I am a co-PD for recipes and lead the Ohio State Food Waste Collaborative. Next Monday, as part of the Waste Expo in New Orleans, I'll be presenting some updated figures from our Recipes National Household Food Waste Tracking Survey. We've just completed our 7th wave of data collection since the inaugural kind of wave of data collection back in February and March of 2021. The results of that tracking survey show that household food waste levels, after peaking in late winter, early spring of 2022, have declined, but remain substantially higher than during those observed during that early pandemic first wave back in February, March of 2021. So today, with the help of our speakers, we explore one possible pathway to address food waste in general. To many of us on this webinar, trying to understand the dynamics of food waste at the consumer level, we've been very fascinated by the approaches being used in South Korea, but kind of frustrated too, because we have seen very limited information about how those policies and plans were kind of rolled out in that country and how the impacts of those policies on household food waste in South Korea. In South Korea, they implemented a tax on the amount of food waste generated, and this tax was often applied at the household level. Many of us have been keenly interested in understanding how the policy works, how it actually affects household waste and other behaviors, and whether such a policy could ever be realistically deployed in some way, shape, or form in a place like the United States, which obviously has very different societal norms and a wider variety of kind of infrastructure across our municipalities. Well, today's the day we bring together the experts to explore these very questions. Dr. Seung-Hoon Lee will present a synopsis of his research on the South Korean experience. We welcome him from MIT. We'll then bring to the webinar stage after that Elaine Blatt from Oregon DEQ. Sorry, Elaine, didn't mean to relocate you. Oregon DEQ, and Yvette Cabrera from NRDC to discuss and interpret the relevancy of these results for the United States. So without further ado, I turn over the screen to Dr. Lee.
All right, can everyone see the screen or no?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. It's just me that I cannot see my screen. Just give me 1 second, please. Okay, great. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. And I think it's a great time to talk about food waste, given that we just had Earth Day. Today, I'm going to talk about the experience of food waste tax in South Korea and how that has affected households' time use and also food usage. and also discuss its implications for climate change. Brian, I have about 20 to 25 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right, perfect. So yeah, without further ado, let me just jump in. So I think the audience here, we all understand that like food waste is really important issue. So maybe this motivation slide is a little bit redundant, but as a fresh reminder, I would just want to say that among many problems that food waste is creating, greenhouse gas emissions is one of them. And life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from wasted food is comparable to that of road transportation. So this is really large problem when it comes to climate change issues. And surprisingly, and also somewhat unfortunately, way less attention is given to food waste problems, especially given that how much policy effort is given to reduce emissions from road transportation. And if we think about what a government can do to address this problem, a econ textbook type of solution is imposing a tax on waste generation behavior. But the critical gap in the literature is that there's very limited empirical evidence as to the benefits and costs of such a tax. And what do I mean by that? So if we first think about the benefit side, efficacy of such a tax is a priori ambiguous. And there's a couple of studies that have shown that salient taxes can produce much larger impact than what a theory promises. So when a tax is, very easily recognizable, then it has very large impact. But at the same time, the taxes with loopholes, which are prone to behavioral responses, and in these cases, the impact of tax can be seriously undermined. So the effect or the efficacy is a priori unclear. And if we switch gear to the cost side, we have even sparser empirical evidence because the focal point of literature has been evaluating the benefit side of policy. But you can easily imagine that without understanding the cost side of it, it's really hard to tell whether such a tax is socially desirable or not. It will be desirable when the benefit outweighs cost, but it's hard to determine without knowing the cost side as well. So what I do in this paper is essentially estimate those two parameters, benefits and costs, and also explore why such a tax is working by looking at the mechanisms. And I would argue that South Korea is a perfect setting to study this question because it's a place where we can estimate the benefits and costs using available data sets. So to this end, I collect 4 different data sets on households' food usage, so purchased, consumed, and wasted food, and also households' time use. And there's also 2 waves of plausibly exogenous tax rollout due to the central government's mandate. So this is a policy variation that I use to estimate the impact of the tax. And these 2 figures or pictures show how the tax collection is working in practice. So if you are living in a large apartment complex or condominium complexes, then you are likely to be on this right-hand side regime where you are required to use this smart card system. And the way it works is very similar to public transit fare collection system. So each household has their smart card and they need to tap their card whenever they dispose of their food waste. And this kiosk has an electric weighing machine inside of it, which automatically measures and charges households accordingly. If you are living in other housing types, such as multi-dwelling units, then you are likely to be on this left-hand side regime, where you have to purchase these official trash bags in advance from places like supermarket and have to use it to dispose of your food waste. So more generally, how did the tax expansion happen in practice? So to understand that, we need to look into 2 landmark policies initiated by the central government, which I call as Wave 1 and Wave 2 expansion of food waste tax. So the Wave 1 policy, which happened in 2005, the focal point of the policy was asking people to separate their food waste from landfill waste. And because the emphasis of the policy was in separation, majority of households are paying flat tax. In other words, because the goal of the policy was not to reduce waste, They didn't necessarily charge unit-based pricing, but just charged flat tax to everyone. But there are still about 30% of households which were faced unit tax, but majority of were paying flat tax. And then in wave 2, recognizing the limitation of imposing flat tax in reducing waste in the first place, the central government required local governments to expand unit-based food waste tax in 2013. And as we have seen before, the expansion happened through two different ways, using trash bags for non-condominium residents or smart card system for condominium residents. And importantly, not all households received tax treatment at the same time because this smart card system was costly. So there was a difference in the timing, there was like about 30% of households that didn't receive this unit tax treatment until the end year of my sample period, which is 2017. So I used those households as a control group to estimate the impact of the tax. And I also want to emphasize that the tax amount was very small. It was on average about 6 cents per kilogram or about 3 cents per pound of food waste. Or if you're a household with an average food waste quantity, your dollar tax amount will be a little over $1 per month per household. And to give you a sense of how small this $1.3 is, it's only about 0.4% of average grocery spending amount per month, or gasoline tax in South Korea is typically $2 to $3 per gallon. So that gives you a sense of how small this $1.3 is. With this background in mind, this paper asks 3 specific questions. First is, what is the benefit of the policy? And to this end, I estimate the effect of the tax on food usage, specifically how it changes food waste quantity, food purchase quantity, and also food intake quantity. And using these empirical estimates, I calculate the greenhouse gas reduction effect of the tax. And I compare this benefit, namely the reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, to the program cost, so the money government has to spend to construct a cost effectiveness measure, which is one way to evaluate a policy. Up until this point, I haven't talked about the additional big chunk of cost, which is households' effort cost. So in the second part of the paper, I switch gear and ask, what is the cost of abatement? In other words, what is the cost of effort that households has to put in to reduce food waste quantity? And to that end, I estimate the impact of the tax on household effort with a focus on households' time usage in meal production. And in the last part of the paper, I explore potential mechanisms. And for that, I first disentangle the impact of a tax that can be explained by the price effect versus non-price effect. And I do this exercise because, as I alluded to before, the tax is very small, but the effect size is disproportionately large. So an immediate question is, why such a tax is such a large effect? And to answer that question, I do this exercise of decomposing the effect into price versus non-price effect. Once I do that, I explore which class of non-pecuniary, namely non-price channels, prevail in this setting. So that's the roadmap of the paper. So before I show you some results, let me just spend one slide, give you some background information. And it is about the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from wasted food. And the key point I want to deliver here is that more than 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions from life cycle of the food waste is coming from the farm to kitchen stage. So let's take a look at this graph here, which I've taken from Kripa et al., which came out in Nature Climate Change 2 years ago. And I want you to focus on this gray box here, which represents the greenhouse gas emissions from the waste treatment stage. So once food becomes waste, and how much greenhouse gas emission will be emitted from the treatment stage. And as you can see, it's very small. It's only about 10% of the total greenhouse gas emissions, which suggests that over 90% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the broadly defined production stage, right? So a practical implication is that food waste prevention is an order of magnitude more important and effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from wasted food. So, for instance, like methane capture from landfill sites is effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from wasted food, but it's so much more effective not to grow the food that's going to be wasted in the first place. So with that in mind, let me show you some results. So the very first results is about set of results are about the benefit side of the policy. And I find that the effect of small food waste tax is remarkably large. Specifically, the tax lowers per household food waste quantity by about 20% and grocery purchase quantity by about 5.5%. And when we compare these two numbers, 46 kilograms to 53 kilograms in levels, it suggests that the actual reduction explains about 85% of the reduction in the food waste quantity, which again means that upper bound of leakage or illegal dumping is only about 15% of the reduction in the waste quantity. And I also find that the effect size is about 3 times larger for perishable items like fresh fruit or fresh vegetable than the storable items. And finally, because households are pushed to purchase less groceries in the first place, an average household saves about $172 per year for buying less food. And this graph here just illustrates the point that I made earlier. So this shows the impact of tax on food purchase quantity. And the x-axis here shows the timing. So 0 means the first year that policy has been implemented. 1 and 2 is the following years, whereas minus indicates the previous years before policy implementation. And as you can see, before this policy implementation, there's no real difference between the treated and control groups in terms of grocery purchase quantity. But so that's why the difference is at 0. But once this tax policy kicks in, the treated households, where the unit-based tax treated households, they reduce grocery purchase quantity by about 5% in comparison to the households in the control group. And with that in mind, so we've already covered this first bullet point chunk. With that in mind, let's proceed further about the effect of the benefit side of policy. So one immediate question that comes to mind after hearing this finding that people purchase less groceries and people purchase less perishable items, an immediate concern is, okay, does that mean people consume less food? Or even if they consume the same amount of food, does it mean they consume less healthy food? So to answer these questions, I look at the impact of the tax on food intake quantity and also nutrition quality, and find that the tax has null effect on both of these two outcome variables, which suggests that the reduction in the grocery purchase is coming from previously wasted part of the food basket rather than the consumed part of the food basket. And this is possible because they were wasting enough amount of food in the first place, so before taxation, so there were enough room for improvement without hurting or compromising their nutritional needs. So using these empirical estimates, I calculate the net greenhouse gas reduction effect from the tax, and which is equivalent to removing about 576,000 vehicles off the road as an entire nation. And when I compare this benefit to the administrative cost of implementing this policy, the program cost of reducing 1 ton of CO2 is only $18. But importantly, because waste pickup and treatment service is very costly budget item for many local governments, when food waste quantity is going down by about 20%, that also generates a very large budget savings, right? So when we take that into account, this $18 price tag actually becomes negative. So far, the policy sounds really rosy, but what's the cost, right? In addition to the cost incurred on government, what are the costs on households? So to explore that possibility, I study, what happens to the household's meal production time after this taxation, and I find that people use more time to compensate. Specifically, I find that after this tax, annual time used on food production goes up by about 7%, or about 68 additional hours per household. So that's about a little over like a little over 1 hour per week, right? And to explore what exactly households are doing in these additional hours, I use web search data and find suggestive evidence that households seem to spend more time better organizing their groceries. So people seem to spend time, organizing their refrigerator. And given survey results that households tend to forget what's inside of their pantry or refrigerator and make duplicate purchases, organizing refrigerator can substantially improve the efficiency of their food usage, of course, at the cost of time. And I also put a dollar value to these additional hours spent and find that this is about $168 per year. And while this is non-trivial amount of money, monetary cost, when we compare this $168 to the reduction in the grocery savings amount, it almost completely offset. The bottom line is that although households spend quite a lot of effort, they are not necessarily worse off because of the reduction or the offset power from the reduction in the grocery purchases. So in the very last part of the paper, I explore why such a tax is such a large impact. And I decompose the effect of the tax into the portion that can be explained by price and non-price, and find that the price alone can explain only about 5% of the reduction in the grocery purchases, which means that people do not reduce their grocery purchases because they want to save $1 that they have to pay for tax in a given month. It's something else. And this finding is like 5% of the tax effect can be explained by price. So such a small price effect is consistent with very small intensive margin effect. In other words, once the unit-based taxation is implemented, additional increase in tax rate. So in other words, instead of like 3 cents per pound, suppose the tax rate goes up to 6 cents per pound. That doubling the tax rate doesn't really induce further reduction in the grocery purchases. Instead, the tax seems to raise households' awareness on food waste. And let me show you this graph here, which is consistent with raising awareness. So this graph here shows what happens to the household food waste quantity for the smart card system. And importantly, for the smart card system, there's usually 1 month of pilot period where households start to use the system and start to get the feedback on their individual waste generation, but the price is the same as before. And as you can see, even in the month 1, there's about 10% reduction in the in the food waste quantity, which suggests that providing information, providing feedback alone can have impact on households' waste generation behaviors. Okay, so for the remainder of the time, let me discuss a few policy-related questions. So the first question that pops up is, to what extent these findings are generalizable? How much is this country-specific and context-specific? And to this end, I think it's useful to compare the findings of this paper to previous, 2 strands of previous literature. One is that there are a couple of papers that I've found that environmental taxes can induce disproportionately large effect. So for instance, this paper by Homonov found that imposing a 5 cents per bag plastic bag tax reduced plastic bag usage by 40%. And clearly, this is not about the money, right? But this is about the tax changing, presumably social norms, or there might be some behavior effect that triggers that this policy is leveraging. And the other strand of literature that I find it useful to compare is papers on nudge. So given that the food waste tax here is not working through price, but similar to nudges that raises awareness or provides information, it might be useful to compare findings of this study to earlier studies that have looked at the impact of report cards on households' electricity or water usage. And these papers find that these report cards reduce usage by 2 to 5%. And the pilot period effect that I find is about a 10% reduction in the food waste. Although this is much larger than 2 to 5%, this might be attributable to the difference or in the frequency of feedback. So these report cards are sent out usually, once a month or, twice a month, but the smart card system feedback is provided like 2 to 3 times per week. So it's much more frequent and much more salient feedback that is provided here. So that may explain why the effect size is larger in my case. So more broadly, taken like these evidence together, the way I see this is like well-designed interventions like can induce pro-environmental behaviors from the households, irrespective of the country and also context. So these studies are conducted in the US and some parts of Europe, and the general findings are similar. And the other question is how realistic is to implement food waste tax? So what does it take to implement this policy? And it requires two things. First is waste has to be segregated, like from food and others, and waste has to be taxed. So if we think about the taxation first, about 1/3 of municipalities in developed countries, including US, have some form of waste pricing, although it's not specifically for food. Right? And food waste segregation mandates are in place in many parts of the world, including China, India, and parts of the US. California and Maine are the leaders in requiring the waste segregation. So I would say, although it's still not there, we are building up the infrastructure to ultimately getting to the food waste taxation policy. And the other question is, can we expect similar effect size? And here I look at the reduction potential, right? And consumer and food waste in other developed world is similar to South Korea. So in North America, about 60% is wasted, whereas in South Korea, it's about 45%. So it's even larger potential in the US. And there is a study that have found that average US households spend about $2,000 per year on food they never consume. So US households also may have some incentive to reduce their food waste for their own good. So this is the last slide before conclusion. Let me just spend 1 minute on this issue. Another policy issue that might be relevant is, okay, which is better, carbon tax on food versus food waste tax? And carbon tax on food is theoretically more appealing, but it may not work in practice for 3 reasons. The first reason is that it may not be practical, and that is because non-CO2 greenhouse gases such as methane are very costly to measure. And that is because methane emissions for, say, producing 1 pound of beef varies a lot by how they grow cows. And it's real, which means that, some reporting scheme has to verify methane emissions for each of the farms, which is extremely, extremely costly. And this is stark contrast to CO2, where you can easily measure the greenhouse gas emissions by using the amount of fossil fuel that has been consumed. And this is such a tax, carbon tax on food is, unlikely to be politically feasible because this tax is likely to be regressive and it may hurt food security. So as it's not surprising that, tax on food is least popular climate change policy among all the policy options. So it may be very difficult to implement this in when we take into account political science. And there's question about effectiveness of these types of policies as well. And that is because carbon tax is likely to affect the final price that consumers are paying. But we know that food demand is inelastic. So maybe these types of taxes are effective in generating revenue, but not so much about reducing the food purchase quantity in the first place. So given these limitations, I would argue that food waste tax might be more effective, or at least as effective as carbon tax on food waste. So for the interest of time, let me just finish up with this first bullet point. This paper studies benefits and costs of a corrective tax on food waste. For benefit, I show that the tax reduces wasted and purchased food without hurting nutrition, which results in reducing large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The cost side, households put substantially more effort into managing their food usage, but they do not seem to be worse off because of the savings from the grocery purchases. And the tax affects behavior primarily through raising awareness about food waste among the households. Okay, thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and also the discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. we'll move forward. We'll have some clarification questions. I'll check Q&A and from Elaine and Yvette. Elaine and Yvette, while you unmic and get ready, one question from the Q&A box. How are the taxes enforced and what is the cost of enforcement? And then after you answer that, Yvette and Elaine, feel free to ask kind of some clarification questions of Seung Hung as well.
Yeah, so the tax enforcement. So I guess the question is about how to ensure compliance. That's the way I read the question. And there are a couple of things that governments are doing. So I think spot check is presumably the most effective or powerful way the governments are engaging to ensure compliance. So the typical way of engaging in illegal dumping in this South Korean urban setting is just put everything into landfill waste bag. And because unit price of landfill waste bag is slightly lower than food waste, there's a small economic incentive to put everything into landfill waste bag. But presumably larger saving is that you don't have to separate it out. So it saves a lot of effort cost. So you just put everything in the landfill waste bag and throw it away. So yeah, governments oftentimes maybe once or twice a year, there's a week they do intensive spot checks. So they open up the landfill waste bag, and if there's any evidence that they can link it to a specific household, then that household will be facing a fine, which is quite hefty. It's about $100 per violation. So that's, I would say, the primary way that governments is using to enforce this policy. But for sure, it's not perfect. So that's why
that's the $18 per ton of CO2 eliminated is from the cost of administration to kind of police the system and a spot check.
Well, so $18 does not include that. So
okay.
It doesn't include that. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. A few more popped up. Yvette and Elaine, go ahead and ask questions of Seung Hung at this point, if you would, and then we'll ask some questions of you.
Yeah, I'll jump in and thank you for that work, Sinhyun. It's amazing, and I've been very interested in your presentation and reading your paper. So I'm an implementer, and so my head immediately goes to kind of the practicality and the nuts and bolts of doing something like this. And I wonder if you could expand a bit more on how collection is done in South Korea. I gathered from your paper, for example, that recyclable and recoverable materials actually aren't charged for collection, and that the charges is really charges are really around garbage. And I'm curious because you talked about the smart card process and how people get feedback 2 to 3 times per week. How does the feedback work for households who are putting out the bags?
Yeah. So those are all great questions. So the way feedback is provided at the smart card system is, if you look at this panel here, there's a small screen which people can learn the amount of food waste and also the price. So that's quite straightforward for smart card system users. For this bag users, we don't have such a feedback system, but anecdotes suggest that people generate their own feedbacks, and that is because usually, it takes a couple of days to fill up this bag. So the smallest unit is about 2 liters or 3 liters, depending on, so which is about, say, a little less than gallon or maybe half a gallon. That's the size of a typical bag, smallest size of waste bag. And it takes, somewhere between, like, say, 3 days or even a week for an average household to fill up this bag. And the trouble with this bag is that it invites lots of insects when it's just left outside, which gives an immediate feedback about how troublesome it is to generate food waste. So some people put this in their freezer while until they fill up their bag. And I think those types of inconvenient activities forces people to think about food waste. So it's not the same type of feedback that people get from the smart card system in numbers, but in terms of how much waste they're generating, I think they're constantly, if this bag system also forces people to think about how much waste that they are generating because of those inconveniences.
Thanks.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for the paper and this presentation. I really loved reading through the paper, and it gave me a lot to think about. So thank you. I have a question around how the taxes that are collected are used, because I have read a lot about soda taxes, or taxes on sugar sweetened beverages as an effort, as like a public health measure. And I have read a lot about the Berkeley case study, the city of Berkeley in California specifically, and how the system that they set up allowed for the taxes that were collected to be redeployed to initiatives focused on public health, for example. And so actually some of the research that I've been seeing has demonstrated that instead of being a regressive tax and having kind of a outsized burden on low-income populations, it's actually the opposite and somewhat of a progressive tax. Again, this is like research I've seen. I don't know how widespread that research is, but I with that, and my understanding is that because the kind of tax structure was developed in that way, it actually means that more funding is actually benefiting low-income communities. And so I'd be curious to hear if that is something that you've looked at in South Korea and how that's structured there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a key difference between waste tax and soda tax. And soda tax is not in return to the service that government is providing. So there's no cost involved in implementing soda tax, or they don't provide a service regarding providing soda, right? Whereas in waste case, governments have to provide, well, in some sense, even before thinking about penalizing people for generating waste, this tax was initially introduced to recover the cost of providing service of waste pickup and treatment. So it's very natural to think about like where the revenue should go. It's to provide, like, to fund the waste pickup and treatment services. And even after taxing people of say 6 cents per kilogram, it's still way short of the operation cost. So government have to still subsidize about more than half of the total budget that they are spending on waste services. So I think that's less of a concern in this context, because there's very natural and immediate place to spend the tax revenue. And to speak of progressivity versus regressivity, I think this tax is in some sense progressive, because the households that generate lots of waste are wealthy households who have money to buy a lot of food, and like under the flat tax regime, everyone's paying the same, although wealthier households are generating a lot more waste. Whereas in this case, you are paying proportional to your waste quantity, which means that it's likely that wealthier households are paying more tax to this, right? Because they're generating more waste.
Right. Now I want to turn the tables a bit and bring into play kind of the great insights that Elaine and Yvette have gathered over the course of their careers to think about, and if I could have you reflect on kind of the aspects of the South Korean situation that you think are kind of more or maybe less relevant in the US, given the differences that we have here in governance structures and kind of societal norms. And don't know if Yvette or Elaine want to take the first crack at this. Yvette, go for it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks, Brian and OSU, for hosting this webinar. So one of the key things that I noticed in reading the paper and listening to the presentation is actually something that was written out in the presentation, which is if you don't have food waste measurement, it's really hard to tax it, right? And so I think that that's, for me, one of the key differences or potential pain points in the US is that we don't currently have a widespread system for food waste measurement at the household level, and it varies between every single city you would go to, right, or town. And I don't have the numbers on this, but my hunch is that we have way more cities not measuring than actually measuring. And so I think that in order to get an accurate capture of like what this tax would look like, I think we would need a lot better data and a kind of generalized system for collecting that data across cities. And I was reflecting on how, like, what this might look like at a wider scale. And generally in the US, waste management is handled at a local level. And so if thinking about how to do this at a federal level seems quite difficult, but I think there are things to do at the federal level. Like, I think that the federal government, for example, could explore, grant programs or funding programs to roll out or like explore a program like this, but the actual tax incentive side seems quite difficult at a kind of national level. But that was kind of my first reflection, is that how to go about this without first having this kind of mandatory separation and measurement mechanism in place in a city.
Elaine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and and Yvette gave me a perfect opportunity to segue into what waste collection and waste management and recycling and recovery looks like in the state of Oregon, which I think illustrates some of her points. As Yvette mentioned, most of waste collection is highly decentralized in terms of governance at the local level, and that's certainly true in the state of Oregon. We set some pretty high level policy about waste collection. We direct municipalities to provide certain services, and in the state of Oregon, organics collection is an option for localities. It's not a requirement, and as a result, we see that organics collection actually isn't very widespread in our state. I'm sorry to say, and only occurs in some of our higher population areas, like the Portland metropolitan area, Lane County, which is the location of Eugene, and Springfield, our second largest sort of population centers. And then the other difference from the context that is in place in South Korea is that when food waste is collected, at least in our state, it is typically collected in combination with yard waste. And that makes the collection simpler. And so, yeah, I'm totally intrigued by how we could get to measurement of food waste, and we can talk about that at greater length. But the mechanics of how we do waste collection and with particularly when we collect food waste, that it's all embedded in the yard waste, which is typically vastly larger than food waste, would make that complicated. And then the other thing I'll just note is that our fee structure is exactly that flat tax rate that you all had in South Korea until you changed it, which is everyone is paying a fee, a monthly fee for waste and other materials collection, and there's, we kick around the notion of pay as you throw policies in Oregon all the time, but we haven't gone there, and so that would be a challenge for us. And I think I'll just stop there.
Let me just clarify one thing. So like similar to the US, I think the waste, administration, like jurisdiction for waste policies is like basically localities in South Korea as well. So each municipality are responsible for providing their own waste services. But it's just that, I think the idea is similar to what Yvette has mentioned. So central governments introduce this mandate that, local governments have to do X, Y, and Z, but they essentially said you have to do it, and they provide the financial incentives to do it, and or financial incentive penalties for not doing it. So so essentially, all the municipalities follow the central government's mandate, but that's why they did it at a different timing. So they wanted to see how others are doing and whether it's working well before introducing it to their own jurisdiction. So that's why some municipalities did it earlier than others. But I just wanted to clarify that even in South Korea, it's all done by local governments. So and central government's role was like creating sort of like the master plan and like blueprint, and then provide financial incentives.
And I guess that prompts me to jump in with one last thing about the Oregon context that I think actually applies to most other places in the U.S. Is that in addition to the fact that it's localities who are really driving this, at least in Oregon, our system is franchise focused. So our municipalities are contracting with individual private companies to collect materials, and so that changes the dynamic of how we recover the costs of collection, because we're literally all paying private companies to do it for us.
I think that's also quite common in South Korea as well. So some municipalities, do it as like with government officers, but I think that's quite rare. So we also do franchise. Yeah.
Young Hoon, do you have questions, given that you've been thinking about this topic for more than a year now, for Elaine and Yvette, giving their U.S. perspective, and Yvette and NRDC have been looking at multiple municipalities around the country. Elaine's got deep experience in Oregon and has advised many other states and municipalities on this as well. Questions that you might have for them on this topic?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking a lot about whether this is something we can implement in the US. And I'm just poking around a few places to see if this is something that can be done in the US. But my sense is that going in a one step from nothing to taxation might be a little bit too much. So I was curious, if governments would be interested in even measuring and providing feedback on like their behavior, because I think it might be a lot easier to sell like politically than like this is something we're going to tax you based on your waste quantity. So do you think that might be feasible? So if we leave out the tax part and just do measurement and informing people, do you think that's something sellable or implementable? And the other thing I was thinking was maybe this policy is not something appropriate in this effective, I should say, probably for like relatively sparsely populated areas. So if we think about Oregon, maybe this policy might be most effective in say Portland or maybe Eugene, but not the rest of the places. And my personal sense is that if we can tackle implement some version of this policy in say top 30 largest cities in the US, that would be still a huge success. So yeah, just those are some like random thoughts that I had about like implementing this in the US. But yeah, curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm happy to jump in, just because part of my interest in reading your paper was that it caused me to think a lot about the ways that we might go down this path or something like it, and based on your research, and I'll start by saying I've been working on food waste in the state of Oregon since 2016, and we have been searching for that elusive policy driver that will help us reduce household hazardous waste. The bulk of our work to date has been, and I think this is probably true, and Yvette can probably confirm this, that has been on voluntary behavior change efforts that are helpful but haven't gotten us very far down the pathway. And what interested me a lot about your findings was the impact of the non-pecuniary, the measurement part. And so that's precisely where I went. And I will say, in Oregon, this is probably not true elsewhere, in Oregon, we are actually taking up the issue of food waste recovery this summer in a fairly substantial way, because we haven't done it very well. We've missed statutory goals in our state for that recovery. And what I feel like your findings give us an opportunity to do is think about this issue of measurement. And if we ultimately implement more stringent food waste recovery requirements in our state, I think about the possibility that we could somehow incorporate food waste measurement into those requirements in a way that's meaningful. And furthermore, to your point about where we could implement it in our state, we have the ability to create policy that applies only to the largest populations. We don't want to burden smaller, more remote communities with costs that are impossible for them to bear. So so from my perspective, your work has some direct relevance to me in the very near term in helping me think about how we might move forward with our own food recovery work.
I completely agree with Elaine. I thought that that was one of the most interesting findings. And I would say it's one of the things that we think about a lot, right? Even in our own households, like once we start actually separating organic waste from our trash, there's an immediate gut reaction for many people. Because you see it. It's like you can actually see how much you could be potentially composting or even preventing from happening in the first place. So I do think that there are huge benefits to just not just measurement, but the act of separation in and of itself. And I do think I think there is appetite from cities to move in this direction, but the question of how is a big one. And so one of the things that NRDC has been working on, and I will actually just put this link in the chat for everyone to see. This is a model municipal ordinance on mandatory reporting for large food waste generators. And so again, this is not specific to households, so just want to be transparent about that. This is aimed at large food waste generators. But this is, I would say that this is kind of like a stepping stone to getting to kind of more widespread measurement. But this would basically, if passed at the municipal level, would basically mandate that food waste generators that produce over a certain kind of threshold of food waste per week have to report on a regular basis to their local government about what they're generating and where it's going, right? Like, is it going to composting? Is it being rescued? Or is it getting landfilled or incinerated? And I would say that from our perspective is really the first step towards some kind of more aggressive policy measures. And I will say, I think that we are seeing more aggressive policy measures in place at the, particularly at the state level, but also at the city level. So I believe we have now 9 states that have organic waste bans in place and at the state level. And I think that though they're structured differently, the ultimate goal is the same, which is to disincentivize food waste and other organic material from entering the landfill or an incinerator. And we're seeing huge effects kind of higher up the EPA food recovery hierarchy, right? So when these food waste generators, when it becomes more expensive to put food waste in a landfill, or you're not allowed to, they are forced to figure out how to, like, an alternate kind of purpose for that or use case. So they're recovering more food and donating that food and or moving that towards composting or anaerobic digestion. And so I think we've already seen some of the initial results for that. So Vermont has seen their food donation triple since their organic waste ban has been in place, and Massachusetts has a 22% increase in donation. And so again, this is not every state has their kind of organic waste ban trickle down to the household level, but some do. So California, for example, is one of the states where their organic waste ban goes all the way down to the household level. And I would say, for better or for worse, the onus is on municipalities to figure out how to do that with guidance from the state, and also technical assistance and funding from the state. So from my perspective, there is a lot of movement, but particularly around the measurement piece, it's a tough nut to crack for at a large scale for cities and states.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in by saying that we've seen similar outcomes with regard to commercial waste, food waste mandates. Here in the city of Portland, our metro regional government is in the process of enacting a food waste ban for commercial food service, and they're using it as an opportunity to push food waste prevention and donation, largely to help businesses comply. But what we get concerned about at the household level in the state of Oregon is that, for example, donation, which Yvette just alluded to, which is a significant way that businesses reduce their waste generation, isn't really possible at the household level, right? So households aren't donating waste or donating surplus food to hungry people. And what we have seen in the materials recycling context in our state is a little bit of a tendency for people to simply throw things in the recycling bin and not reduce their generation of those materials upstream because it's just too easy. And so when we think about, and as we move forward, frankly, this summer with our work on food recovery policy, we're going to be looking very specifically at how we can avoid any impacts that might encourage people to simply throw their food waste in the recovery bin and not do anything about it upstream.
Yeah, I really like that. Yeah. uh, Brian, so I also have like one more question for the panelists, but at the same time, I also noticed that there are quite a lot of questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
So do you want me to go over some of these, or, you know?
I guess my question is, are those answers pretty obvious from reading your paper? Could people do a control F and find out whether or not the items are being composted or things like that? So, because that might be a cleaner way to deal with those than taking up some of this time at the end. So I put the link to your paper in the chat, so to the March 31st version of the paper. So hopefully people can find some of the technical details about how time was being measured and nutrition was being assessed, and what was happening with all that good food that was put into those lovely kiosks and things like that. But I just want to make sure our panelists have a kind of a last second here for any last thoughts that they'd like to share with the group before we close for the day. We've only got about 2 minutes left. So Seung-Hoon, do you want to, since you're on mic, have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, so so it's again about the US households, and this is more of a, I guess, question for Elaine and Yvette. But I noticed, like, one thing I noticed is that many of the policy efforts in the US is really focusing on recycling or better using the already generated food waste. But that, which makes me to wonder, given the current living arrangement of the US households, do you think it's really hard to ask people to prevent their food waste in the first place? So in other words, do you think there might not be too much effect to go into that direction? Do you think it might be more effective and maybe more cost effective to just focus on the recycling part? Because given the lifestyle of the US households, any effort to prevent the food waste in the first place might not be too effective. So that you want to hear your thoughts on that.
I hope not. Let me just say that, and I say that because in the state of Oregon, we're hyper focused on prevention in the program I work in, materials management. The state of Oregon conducted the first subnational consumption-based emissions inventory. We're very aware of the upstream impacts of food production, as you pointed out in your paper, so at least in the state of Oregon, we're not ready to give up. But what we are doing now is trying to look at our food waste management in a much more integrated way. And as I've already mentioned, and I'll stop quickly because we're running out of time, what we really want to do is see if our policies can all work together to achieve a better result. So that's why I'm particularly, and I'll just wrap up by saying, very intrigued by this notion of how we might be able to incorporate measurement and feedback to households as we move forward with our food recovery work.
And I'll just quickly say NRDC is not ready to give up on prevention either. And we have a whole campaign dedicated towards raising awareness around food waste reduction. And I will say, oftentimes when we work with cities, the initial interest is around composting. And what we try to do is say yes, and there's always a way to incorporate food waste prevention education and awareness in existing efforts around composting and kind of more end of life solutions. And so for us, it's a question of making sure that we're tackling it on all ends.
Yeah, I just, want to, I think it's in general very useful to not to confuse people like, oh, I do composting, so I do my fair share. That's not the message that, I think government wants to deliver to people. But I think in many cases, and a typical household probably wouldn't know the difference between, composting versus reducing the waste in the first place, right? So I think, focusing too much on composting or other forms of food waste recycling may crowd out the effort to prevention. And that's something I think might be useful to keep in mind based off of the findings of
With that, we've got to close. Sadly, this is a great topic. Thank you, Seung-Hoon, for your incredible research, and Yvette and Elaine for putting it into great perspective. This will be the recording will be stored online at Recipes website. We'll email all the participants and the attendees with those links, and hope to see some of you maybe live and in person, maybe at Waste Expo or the Refed Summit coming up in St. Louis, which will be soon close to Seung-Hoon's new academic home as well. So thanks everyone. Thanks to participants. Sorry we didn't get to all those great questions, but perhaps another day, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. And